Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video in our A to Z sewing technique series, I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make loops for your sewing project. You will need a loop turner for this project, but before we get into all that, let's talk about why we might need to make loops in the first place. Probably the most common reason to make a loop is if you are in need of a spaghetti string of some kind. So whether that is for creating a waist tie or maybe a spaghetti strap garment, you might need to make a loop for those. Some of my favorite ways to use this technique is to create belt loops as well as button loops if your garment requires that. Jumping right in, the very first thing that we are always going to want to remember is that for the most part, you're going to want to cut your loops on the bias. If you don't know anything about grain lines, the bias just means that it is on a 45-degree angle from your selvage, which is typically the side of your fabric that will have words printed on it, like the brand name or the collection name or that sort of thing, copyright information. So it'll be a 45-degree angle from that. Now, as you can see, I'm just finger pressing in a crease on the bias and then cutting it out from that because I only need a short strip to show you guys this technique. But if you have a project that needs quite a bit of bias cut, then I would suggest doing the continuous bias method, and I'll link a video below of someone that's doing a good job of teaching that. But basically it makes it so you only have to sew like 1 or 2 lines of stitching versus cutting a whole bunch of pieces of bias and then trying to stitch them all together at the end, and it's just not worth it. It's much better just to cut a continuous line if you can. So I'll link that below if you guys need it. So if you're following along, you might be like, but how wide do I make my bias strip? And the answer to that question is it's going to 100% depend on the project that you're doing, what it is you're trying to make, and what kind of loop you are trying to create. Okay, so there are typically 2 types of loops that I generally see, and it is going to be a flat loop and a rounded loop. Flat loops are typically used for things like belt loops and any kind of strap that might need hardware. For instance, if you are making a spaghetti string top that needs like a bra slider to adjust the length of the strap, you'll use a flat loop. And then if you're wanting to use a rounded loop, typically those are used for decorative spaghetti straps like on lingerie camisoles and things like that. You'll see it rounded. If you're making a button loop, a lot of times those are rounded. Or if you're using it for any kind of decorative embellishment like on top of your garment, I've seen people use a rounded spaghetti for that as well. So a good starting point for me is if I'm wanting my loop to finish 1/4 inch wide, I'm going to multiply that by 4 and I'm going to cut a 1-inch strip. The purpose of this is that if I'm creating something that is rounded, then I'm going to want to have that little bit of seam allowance that is going to stuff the loop for me. That way I don't have to insert a cord or anything like that in it, because that makes it even more complicated in the end. But if I'm wanting to create something that is flat, I need that seam allowance to start, and depending on the type of fabric that you're using, sometimes you're going to want it to fill the area, that way you don't have any nasty ridges on the inside once you press it. Now some fabrics you simply cannot do it because it is too thick for the loop that you are trying to create. Like for instance, if you're trying to make something out of denim or velvet, a lot of times you're going to have to reduce the amount that you are going to have inside the loop itself for your seam allowance because it is just too bulky for you to turn inside out. So in those instances, typically I will cut it to have a minimum of 1/4 inch seam allowance, and if 1/4 inch is too thick to have inside of my loop, I will trim it down to 1/8 inch before I do the next step. So I know that's kind of a lot to absorb before you start cutting, but I'm telling you guys, if you start with this 4 times rule and do a little sample first, you're going to save yourself some heartache in the end if you think that it is a better idea to cut all of your bias at one time and then realize it doesn't work later. It's much better to just cut a little strip and then add or subtract based off of the needs of your project and the fabric that you're choosing, and then go back and cut the full amount that you need for your project. Okay, so once you're past the whole cutting phase of your project, you can go ahead and take it over to the ironing board. And you don't always have to do this, but bias can be a slippery bitch sometimes, especially if you are working with fabrics that are slippery. To begin with, it's even worse because the fabric will stretch on the bias somewhat. So what I like to do is to press it with both sides together, just to have it ready for whenever we start sewing. It'll be that much easier. Once your bias is all pressed up, go ahead and take it over to your sewing machine, and I sewed mine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you're going to want to sew yours with whatever seam allowance you chose in the first step of this project. For the next step of this project, you are going to need a loop turner, and basically all it is a hook with a latch on one end and a loop on the other end to help you pull it through your fabric loop. Okay, so to turn this guy right sides out, we are going to take the hook side of our loop turner. We're going to insert it into the tunnel that we created until the hook actually appears out of the other side. And then we're going to take the little hook and latch part, and we are going to create a hole in the fabric at the very end of our loop, and we are going to hook it through that hole and latch it closed, and then we can start trying to pull it through. Now, admittedly, this is the more difficult part of this entire project. I would say is just getting the loop started can be hard, but once you figure out and get the hang of it, you really won't have very many problems after that, because it'll be super easy to just pull the whole thing through. So on mine, I actually had a little bit too much fabric left over on the tip, and so I cut it into a point and did it that way. That way I had less bulk going through at the initial pulling, but you want to be careful not to poke the hole too close to the edge of the fabric whenever you're doing this, because it is very easy for it to actually tear the fabric and rip free. And while it might not be that big of a deal that you have, a little bit less bias to work with, it is a big deal if it stops halfway through you turning your loop right side out, and then you have to try and figure out how to get it all back so you can start over again. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing it, especially if you're working with a fabric that frays a lot. Okay guys, once you've gotten past the hard part of getting it started, all it takes is a little muscle to pull the whole thing through, and you will have your loop. And like I said before, from here you can create all kinds of things. You can create spaghetti straps, you can create embellishments for your garments, belt loops, fabric loops. If you are wanting it to be flat from here, all you have to do is just press it flat, and if you need some extra stability for it to not become rounded again, you can just put a stitch through the middle or on one side of it, and that works as well. But yeah, from here you're done and you're ready to put it onto any project that you need. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, go ahead and hit subscribe so you guys can see the next video that I post. And if you found this video helpful, go ahead and watch my playlist with my other technique videos and you might learn something new. Bye guys!